you will have seen in the news headlines, in England, there is increasing public awareness and outrage at the extent of sewage pollution in waterways. With over 460,000 sewage discharges, 2023 was the worst year on record for sewage spills in England. And this Sunday, 3rd November, over 100 organizations are taking to the streets in London in the March for Clean Water, demanding an end to sewage pollution. So today, we want to share how sewage pollution is also affecting Scotland's waterways and the communities who live around them. Like in England, Scotland mostly has a combined sewage system, which mixes rainwater runoff that is collected from streets with sewage that comes from households, businesses, and industry. Now, because this system was designed to collect rainwater, it can reach capacity during rainfall. To avoid flooding during this heavy rain, engineers incorporated something that is called combined sewer overflows into the sewage system. These are sometimes abbreviated as CSOs, and you may have heard them referred to as storm overflows as well. And here we have a little visual to help you understand how the CSOs work. So they were built at regular intervals into the sewer system to relieve pressure during heavy rain. And they do this by starting to discharge sewage into a nearby water body, like a river or a beach, when the flow of sewage in the system exceeds a set threshold. Now, it's important to note that the combined sewage infrastructure that we see in much of Scotland today was designed by the Victorians for the sanitation needs of that time. And today, we don't build sewers like this anymore, mostly. New buildings are mostly built with separate sewers, one for sewage and one for rainwater. So when you see news headlines about sewage pollution in the UK and in Scotland, you're most likely reading about discharges from these kinds of CSOs. Much of this CSO infrastructure is aging, and some of it is malfunctioning, like discharging during dry weather and not during wet weather, when what it's meant to do. Sewage contains many pollutants that harm human health and the environment, and discharges from these CSOs not only pollute the water, but the pollutants have also been found in sewage-related debris, like wet wipes that get discharged along the sewage that have been flushed into toilets, beach plastic, and even beach sand. So the health risk of sewage pollution is not limited to people who swim outdoors, but goes beyond the water environment. To give you a sense of the scale of this issue, Scotland has over 3,500 sewer overflows, and in 2023, they discharged sewage into our waterways over 15,000 times. However, because only 4% of these overflows are monitored, the true number of discharges is likely to be higher. Now, these CSOs are regulated by SEPA, but community members that are worried about sewage pollution are struggling to have their concerns addressed. Our free legal advice service has received 23 inquiries about sewage and water pollution. And today we are joined by 2 community campaigners who have very generously agreed to share their experiences. We have Pippa Scott from River Almond Action Group, or RAAG, and Jim Jarvie from Save Our Shore Leith, or SOSLeith. And they will be talking about their experience of trying to hold public bodies on account on cleaning up their local rivers from sewage. And then after they have spoken together, they'll address some common misconceptions about water quality and regulation of sewage in Scotland. And then there will also be time for a Q&A. So please send your questions to me in the chat, and I'll collate them for the Q&A that we'll do at the very end of these presentations. But first, I'll hand over to you, Pippa, for your presentation.
Thank you, Julia. Let me just share some slides as well. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thanks for having me and RAAG, the River Almond Action Group, share our experience of this issue. So the River Almond is a river in Scotland. It starts in Lanarkshire, which is, if you're outside of Scotland, it's kind of in the middle between, in the central belt. The river runs through West Lothian and it reaches the sea at Cramond Beach, just outside Edinburgh. It's a really lovely, kind of valued natural asset. There's walkways along much of the river. There's some great wildlife along the river. And anyone who's kind of been around Cranbourne Beach or along the River Almond will know how kind of lovely it is. The other side, I'd say, of the River Almond is historically it was integral to the shale mining of West Lothian in the region. Its current status today is it's got a poor ecological status as determined by SEPA, and the known pressures on the River Almond are that there's 11 sewage wastewater treatment works along the river, and there's 87 of those CSOs that discharge directly into the River Almond and its tributaries. There's also substantial fish barriers and diffuse source pollution. We know that the way that the water is measured is it's currently sitting with moderate water quality, but we know that in kind of 2019 alone, there was sewage being discharged into the river more than 500 times. And that was from those 87, the percentage of those 87 that are monitored. The reality is probably much higher. So the story I want to tell you today is basically how the River Almond Action Group kind of was formed and the journey that we've had so far. And the story really starts as a story of community outrage. During lockdown, kind of 2020, 2021, a lot of the local community around where I'm sitting today in West Lothian would go out, would kind of navigate to the river for those kind of daily walks or just to kind of get outside, and really benefited from being outside in the natural environment. Many people were probably walking the same stretch of river every day, and they got to know their environment. And what they saw at the pictures that you see, a selection of the pictures that you see here, they noticed discharges entering the river, sometimes discoloring the river. They noticed some of these grates that were kind of entrenched with essentially sewage related debris, which is basically wet wipes, sanitary towels, tampons, nappies, just all it's grouped as sewage related debris, but it's quite clear what it is when you have a look at it. A lot of the river banks and beds and rocks were kind of strewn with this type of waste. And again, many of you may be familiar, there was a lot of kind of litter pick activities that was also happening around that time. Local community members who were going up and litter picking. And I kid you not, there were bags and bags and bags and bags, bin liners of sewage related debris. I think that picture was of the sanitary towel I took myself and had my kids on that litter pick. And I genuinely can't understate how heavy the sewage related debris was in the riverbanks. The Forth Rivers Trust basically helped the River Almond Action Group form into a kind of an organized community. There was a petition that was started, and within a couple of days, those numbers in the petition was already kind of a couple of hundred, entering into a couple of thousand within a very short space of time. The community generally was in a real kind of state of outrage. So what RAAG did in those early days was started to kind of, voice those concerns to representatives, to local councillors, to RMPs, MSPs, and also the water bodies. And I think one message that came through really strongly was, don't worry, everything is fine. Don't worry, these combined sewer overflows, they're an integral part of the network, and they'll only be spilling under heavy rainfall. And the community members were sitting there knowing full well that they were witnessing these outfalls spilling, not on a kind of one in a year rainfall event, 1 in 5 year rainfall event, which is when they're supposed to be spilling as per the Victorian design. It was on days where it was maybe a bit of drizzle, or even on days where there was no rain at all. So there was this real disconnect between the kind of flags that the community was trying to kind of voice and raise up, and the kind of voices that were coming back from Scottish Water. Another really clear message that was coming out whenever these concerns were being raised was, don't worry, anything that's being released through those pipes are unlikely to cause environmental damage. And this is kind of underpinned by quite an old school environmental mitigation kind of philosophy, which is dilution is the solution to pollution, which is being completely debunked. It's now we understand the types of pollutants that are entering our environment. It's very clear that that doesn't work. And I think, again, residents were looking at, as you see the picture there, trees that were very visibly strewn with sewage related debris that was not diluting or dissolving away. They were being washed into the river and washed into the sea and being, found on beaches and then, going into the sea. And I think there was this underlying concern of, if that's what we can see, what else is invisible in the water that might not being managed through dilution. So they were, there was this really strong disconnect between the voice of citizens and saying, like, we're seeing stuff that doesn't feel quite right here, and that the messages that we were getting back, and the complacency kind of was how it felt getting back from the water bodies. There was, we kind of were making noise, I think, on social media, but there was also a lot of kind of attention on this as well. There was similar situations happening all over the UK. Again, I think because people were out and getting to know their natural environment in ways that maybe we hadn't done before. And so going into kind of 2022, Forth Rivers Trust with West Lothian Council and ourselves actually put in a bathing water application for a stretch of the river. It was the first river in Scotland where this had been done. We'd heard it had been done down south in England. And basically it was a way to try and get SEPA to come and monitor what was in the river. SEPA doesn't monitor on a regular basis rivers in Scotland. They only monitor bathing waters. So this was essentially a mechanism that was to try and get that higher level of monitoring to understand what was in the river. And also, there are parts of the River Almond where people do swim. And the one that you see here is in East Calder. And this was the section of the river where the bathing water was applied for. And it is where kind of teenagers will end up swimming on a sunny day. And it's about 1 kilometre downstream of one of the biggest wastewater treatment sites as well. We also, with support from our MP and MSP, they chair a stakeholder group where they convene Scottish Water, Veolia, the water service provider, SEPA, and grassroots groups. And that's been a good forum for dialogue, but there's a limited amount of change that has happened through that stakeholder group. So as we moved 2022 into 2023, RAAG sought ERCS legal support to raise complaints to Environmental Scotland. We did this along 2 avenues. The first one was RAAG felt that we had evidence that looked like SEPA wasn't enforcing the licenses of these wastewater treatment plants. So we submitted our evidence to Environmental Standards Scotland, who took that forward into an investigation into SEPA. And we also raised a kind of a complaint about the process of applying for bathing water. The bathing water application was rejected, but essentially, and immediately after it was rejected, the whole process of applying for bathing water in Scotland changed. And it's actually harder to get a designated bathing water site in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK. And the process itself is not very clear. So they were 2 kind of lines that we really kind of valued from ERCS's support. We've also joined ERCS's Networks for Justice, where we've met Jim from SOSLeith, who you'll hear from shortly, and also just a fantastic group of other environmental activists who I think all share across different environmental issues, but we all share this kind of common ground that actually we're kind of local residents who are trying to say, actually, something we're seeing here that we know our local environment, something we're seeing isn't quite right, and not really getting the response that we're expecting from the bodies who we think should be protecting the river, the local environment. Finally, at the end, this last year, we've also been working with the West Lothian Climate Action Hub, doing kind of direct action with the community, but also kind of convening conversations around this issue. And just in September, we ran a session with Jim from SOSLeith as well, and had speakers from ERCS, ESS, but also kind of heard from other community groups who share similar concerns. So there was groups of local anglers there from the Leith Loch who also have similar concerns about sewage pollution. So I think just to kind of wrap up, what does RAAG want? What would we like to see? And I think on a kind of local level, very much residents they want a river that's free of pollution with good ecological status. Residents really want to know if there's sewage being discharged into the river. They want to be aware of that. They want to be able to be told that that's happening and have that data available to them. There's also been a whole suite of infrastructure planned for the River Almond to get it to that good ecological status, and that's not yet been delivered yet. And reaching that status has been delayed multiple times. Zooming out, I think a little bit from our experience, what we've learned on the River Almond to the kind of wider context, is it's really clear that what we need in Scotland is a commitment for climate resilient water management that prioritizes environmental and public health and doesn't kind of try and play these costs off against each other. They need to kind of be integrated. There's a real need for better accountability and more transparency in this issue. And we really want policy and regulations that are fit for purpose for an aspiring hydro nation and a 21st century Scotland. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pippa. So next, following Pippa's presentation, we'll hear from Jim Jarvie from SOSLeith. Oh, you're on mute, Jim.
Sorry, how's that?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Apologies. Thanks, Julia. Thank you, Pippa, and thank you, everybody, for listening to our talk. So I'm representing a small group called Save Our Shore Leith, or SOSLeith. We're working on the shore area of Leith at the very north of Edinburgh. I want to give a bit of background because our issue isn't just sewage coming into the water, but how it compounds with other dilemmas we're facing in the neighbourhood. First of all, I don't know how many of you know the shore. I mean, we're regularly in things like Time Out as one of the UK's coolest neighbourhoods. We've got a few Michelin star restaurants, other great restaurants and bars. It's a real tourist attraction in Scotland's most densely populated area. And when you see the advertising of the area, this kind of picture is what you envisage: bright, shiny, popular, loud, fun, festival focused. But if that's the case, why do we have this headline in the Times newspaper just last week, October 22nd, raw sewage still polluting the water of Leith campaigners? That's us and a few others. With the interesting strapline below that the environmental regulator, SEPA, says it does not have to test for sewage dispensed into the water of Leith, as the river is not classified as a bathing water. Before I go into this, I just want to give a little bit of background. If you can see the map here, where you see the basins are areas of water between bridges. We have 4 basins here, which used to be part of the commercial port. These are now housing developments, again, the restaurants and the popular area of the shore. I'm actually talking to you from right here in Basin 1, where I live. And a good few years ago, all this water was sold off to a private developer. So since then, it's not been clear what the rights and responsibilities for maintenance of this area is. More to the point is that north of this, of number 1, this is the commercial area of Forth Ports. And in the late 1960s, Forth Ports put in a lock gate. They basically dammed off the tide and put almost like a canal lock in here. This means that the river here, which used to be tidal with 20, 24-foot tidal drafts every day, is now flat. And the reason for that is that the commercial docks now has a flat water that doesn't change. And it can, by putting booms in here, it can stop litter getting in and fouling up ship mechanisms and harbour infrastructure. But what that means is, A, of course, basins are no longer tidal. It means that debris in our basins can't escape. And the water in the basins has now flowed to a canal-like structure, a canal-like flow, and it captures silt. Now, silt is natural. I mean, it comes off the pentlands where the water of Leith originates, about 20 odd miles away, and comes down. Under normal circumstances, silt would be washed out to sea. So what does this mean? First of all, let's take how our campaign started. So in 2019, we had a major storm that brought down this debris, and this was ×2, then ×2 again. It blocked off half the basin. And our residents, a few of us neighbours, got together and said, we need to do something about this. We wrote to the council saying, look at this rubbish in the water, can you help? And they said, well, no, that's owned now by a private developer, not our problem. We wrote to the private developer who said, well, I mean, the litter is really the council's problem, and it's not getting out because Forth Ports have put this boom underneath the bridge, so not our problem. We went to Forth Ports and they said, well, we sold off this water years ago, not our problem. So SOSLeith got started, and we eventually got this issue, along with other campaigns, sorted out. And from there we thought, okay, that's good. We're talking to people. Can we start looking at the issue of silt? Now, 1910, this was from the bridge just up from my house. It's the line here is a high tide mark. It's basically 20-25 feet of tidal depth here. This was when the water was flowing naturally. Today, this same area looks like this. So the silt has come down, it's been captured in the canal, and it's growing and growing and growing. Now, our campaign was interested in looking at this as a flood risk because we note that in other storms, silt moves. We're very, very worried that the low clearance under the bridge is going to get blocked by silt in a storm and with large timber debris and cause a backup. And that was a big focus of what we were trying to do. Then, though, an ex-councillor pointed out these things called CSOs, which we'd never heard of. We found out that we've got 8 CSOs along the basins where we live, the black X's down here. We've also got 64 CSOs further upstream. And what makes our situation, I think, unique, possibly in the UK, is that most of these CSOs aren't, as Pippa's pictures were showing, going into a flowing water. They're going into a semi-solid silt. So we've got 65 CSOs further upstream bringing down waste that then slows down through the canalized water down here and drops it into the basins. We've also got 8 CSOs discharging directly into the silt. So the small campaign group, we were really worried, and we wanted to find out from Seaford and Scottish Water what's being released, when, and what are the impacts, and we got absolutely nowhere. So we contacted ERCS, and as with the RAAG group, we got some great legal advice. And we structured 5 questions. Given the river here is choked by silt and there's little flow out to sea, how much bacteria and bacteria-related pathogens are in the water? What risk does this pose to us in this neighbourhood, the most densely populated area in Scotland? We also note that most of our brown sites are being developed with student residential rental accommodation. As more and more people are coming into the neighbourhood, how much more of a problem is being added? We've got kayakers in the river, we've got fisher folks, we've got people working on maintenance in commercial barges. We wanted to know how much risk are they being put to? And basically, as an area being marketed for tourism, what risk is being posed to tourists and others in the neighbourhood who hang their legs over the river wall and enjoy the sight of the water? And we started writing to the food chain, Scottish Government, SEPA, Scottish Water, the Council. And let me quickly go through the less than satisfactory responses that we got. Here we go. So Scottish Government, this sentence here kind of encapsulates pages and pages of FOIs, correspondence. Ultimately, the Scottish Government response to our questions was saying, SEPA expects unsatisfactory CSOs to be resolved over time, unless it is disproportionate to do so, considering all possible short and long-term solutions, which says nothing. We couldn't get anything along the lines of, how bad is the problem and what are you going to do about it with what timeline? We wrote to SEPA, and SEPA basically refuses to test for sewage-related pollution discharged into the river or into the silt. affecting again the most densely populated neighbourhood in Scotland. What's really interesting is that they're testing for things we think that appear to be agricultural runoff, but things like sewage and the bacterial issues we have down here, there's no interest in testing at all. We've met a few times with Scottish Water, had a lot of correspondence, and ultimately what we thought was really positive was that Scottish Water said the HCSOs in our neighbourhood will now be a top priority for action. But then in writing, they said it's important to note that depending on the complexity of options, work will take time before any decision is made to carry out any physical work, if that's feasible. Then we found out in a face-to-face meeting that given that we're a very densely populated area, that we've got major traffic thoroughfares coming through, it's too much of a problem. So they're probably not going to be doing any major infrastructural work to the CSOs that we are really worried about. The council's really interesting because in February, we helped the council draft a motion that called for the government and SEPA to test for bacterial-related pathogens in the water, not just in our part of the water of Leith, but also in Pippa's area of the River Almond, also in something called the Figget Burn in a nearby neighbourhood of Portobello. And SEPA came back to the Edinburgh Council and said that we're not going to do this sort of testing because the river is not classified as a bathing water. What was also really interesting was as councillors, we're putting forward a motion to help the kind of work that Pippa and I are engaged with. I'd also been in a correspondence with council officials responsible for this, and separately, and I think independently of the councillors, they said having considered all of the above and the circumstances of the river, they're not going to test because it doesn't meet the prejudicial to health test within the 1990 Act. The water is not a bathing water, it's not used for drinking, the silt's not used, so we're not going to test. Which means basically that any water in Scotland, from a council's point of view, if sewage is going into it, it doesn't matter because you're not swimming in it and you're not using it for drinking water. Last slide here, and another article from the Eye. We're getting good press coverage of our issues, despite the fact we're not getting much progress with the government. But we're wanting to have a final ask. And this is something that we're joining up with RAAG and ERCS to really push for next year. We want precise information on how much sewage has been released into our water, how often, and we want to really understand the implications for human and broader environmental health. Scottish Water and the government have been saying that, look, we're going to start monitoring the outflows. We're thinking that's not good enough. You're basically slapping the water, and if you monitor, you will know how much it's being slapped and how often, but we still won't understand how much damage is being done. We want an action plan to mitigate CSO spillage, we want clear timelines, and we want performance indicators. And I think over the 2 years that we've failed to see much progress, we're starting to understand that the direction we need to see is legislation to be made in Scottish Parliament to take action and to mandate SEPA to test, Scottish Water to change the risk we're facing from CSOs. But in the meantime, a critical ask that we have lastly right now is to let people know how much sewage and associated risk we are expected to tolerate in the meantime. It's going to take years to fix the problems. So what's happening in our environment right now? And I'll end on that and pass back to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was very powerful. With your expertise on these issues, I'd now like to throw some statements at you. We'll do some busting of common misconceptions about water quality and sewage regulations in Scotland. Let me just share my screen here. Right. So the first one that we have is that Scotland's waters are in good condition and nature is being protected. And maybe, Jim, you could take this and I'll give you 1 minute to show your expertise on this question.
I will, thank you. Now, we've had this sort of response from SEPA, Scottish Government and Scottish Water that Scotland's water in great condition, 65% is in excellent condition, nothing to worry about. But It's fallacious. I mean, most of Scotland has a low population density, and if you're in those sorts of areas, that's to be expected. But in the central belt, in populated areas like Leith, rest of Edinburgh, right across to Glasgow, that's not the case. There are reports, Pippa's River RAAG, the Ragford River Almond, Glasgow and the Clyde and other ones, that the water is often filthy. And saying that most of Scotland's waters are good, to me, the way I've been responding is to say that's a bit like being told by a doctor, I've got a head trauma, but don't worry about it, the rest of my body is fine. There's an absence of monitoring. Only 4% of CSOs are monitored. So really, what is the full extent of damage being done by CSOs in this country? And secondly, when testing is being done by SEPA, again, it's on bathing waters. More generally, it's on agricultural runoff and pollutants, and it's not for things like antimicrobial resistance. It's not for bacteria. It's not for pathogens. And in our most densely populated areas, that's simply not good enough. And we should really step beyond this myth that Scotland's waters are in good condition. Let's be far more specific about how we address this question.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, we have a just a moment. This is from the Water Classification Hub that SEPA maintains about surface water body condition. And here you can just see what Jim was just saying, how the distribution of water condition is across Scotland. Better in less densely populated areas. So next up, we have this statement: Scotland has an effective environmental regulator for water quality. Pippa, would you like to look at this one?
Yes, sure. I think if you ask me what makes an effective regulator, we're looking for kind of accountability, good transparency, we're looking for enforcement, and we're looking for someone who, you know, an agency who can be kind of predictable and we know the kind of trajectory. I think on the kind of the current status, as we understand it in Scotland, is there's a massive lack of data to actually understand the impact of what these CSOs are having on water quality and ecological status in Scotland. There's a massive lack of monitoring. I think only 4% of the outfalls are monitored. And that in itself is a kind of huge breach of the Water Framework Directives requirements, the EU Water Framework Directives requirements, to have a comprehensive monitoring in place. There's also the enforcement side. I think when we asked how many fines had been issued in West Lothian, the answer was no, none at all, for any breaches of car licenses, despite the fact that we know there have been breaches. And I think the highest ever fine in Scotland for water quality issues was something like 20 grand. It's the enforcement really isn't kind of there. So yeah, I think in terms of having that kind of transparency and accountability, we're just absolutely not there yet. And it's really down to really a lack of sufficient kind of monitoring and data quality.
Thank you. Right. Moving on, we have sewage discharges are caused by climate change. Jim, can you quickly cover this one?
Sure. This one really rattles my cage. My day job, I work in climate adaptation, largely in international development context. And in so many countries I work in, local governments and institutions will say, the problem we got with solid waste, with water, is all to do with climate change. And the same thing is being tried here. And it's simply not true. Climate change is going to have an impact, but the discharges we see right now are resulting from Victorian infrastructure that's not been upgraded and that's lacked investment to make it better. And that Scottish Water is legally allowed to discharge sewage into the water. Yet, despite this, we've had SOSLeith correspondents from SEPA, doctors from SEPA, from Scottish Water, and the government saying climate change is a driver. That led us at SOSLeith to write to SEPA and saying, right, show us the data sets, giving the absolute evidence that you have that climate change is causing CSO discharges in Scotland today. And we got a response back, a long one, and it said basically, SEPA anticipates that climate change may lead to an increase in discharges in the future. In the future. Climate change is not currently responsible for the poor state of polluted rivers and coasts today. One thing I'd raise about this is, despite institutions hiding behind the climate change argument, the infrastructure is already overloaded, and climate change hasn't really started to bite the water systems in Scotland yet. If the situation is this bad already, how is it going to be when climate change really takes bite? And this is why we need urgently a climate action plan to address the freaking infrastructure that we have in this country right now.
Thank you. Next one is Scottish Water is monitoring, screening sewage discharges. We kind of spoke about this already, but Pippa, do you want to cover this?
Yeah, so I think certainly I can speak from the River Almond's point of view and maybe expand it out. We know that we had 87 CSOs on our river. Initially, when we started asking how many of those are screened, how many of those are monitored, the answers we were getting back was, oh, some. And some are, some aren't, but they weren't actually able to give us the final numbers, and it was because they didn't know at that time. So I think it's again this lack of understanding, lack of data of actually how many are being monitored. There's been a bit of a scramble in the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years, where Scottish Water intends to, they identified where their urgent ones were in the system, and they've committed to install 1,000 new monitors by the end of this year, and they're on track for meeting that. But there are another kind of 2,500 CSOs that will remain unmonitored.
Thank you. And yeah, just the note on this slide saying as well that planned monitoring will only tell how often and how much sewage is discharged, so not actually the impact on water quality.
Absolutely.
And then finally, we have statements saying Scotland is faring better than England in terms of water quality. Pippa, Jim, do you want to both speak to this a little bit, and then we'll move to Q&A?
Sure. Okay, where to start? Well, you can start with the governance. There's this assumption that because Scottish Water is a public body, it's going to be better than the private sector companies in England. But that's not the case. I mean, in England, at least there is decent monitoring now, and there's a better understanding of sewage outflows. There are more accurate warnings on beaches when beaches are being overwhelmed by sewage that makes it unsafe to swim. And we simply don't have that data here in Scotland. There's a real data issue. We don't understand how much is going out, how often, with what impact. And England has that, I think, in a far better platform than we have here.
Yes,
Pippa.
absolutely. And, and I think both, it's important to remember that we have a different institutional setup. So here, Scottish Water is publicly owned. In England, their water utilities are privately owned and feed kind of into Ofwat, the regulator. And both of those systems do feed into the bigger picture of the Water Framework Directive, but what's monitored and how it's reported is slightly different. So we're not necessarily able to compare like for like all the time, and we're at each country's at a different part of the kind of investment cycle. When we look at the kind of formal criteria, it looks like England's rivers are faring in a much worse condition than Scotland's are, but Scotland has some great kind of water geography and a hugely different population density. So Scotland may be looking better, but is it because we're actually doing things better, or is it because we've got a favorable kind of situation? When we look at the kind of maybe some of these informal indicators like density of wet wipes on beaches, Scotland is worse. When we look at kind of actually what do we think it's going to cost to fix this problem, in England, there's been a recognition that actually this is going to cost a huge amount of money and we need to do something about it, and we need to really hone in and focus on this issue. We're not there yet in Scotland. There hasn't been that commitment yet to do something about this. And we've not kind of really identified this as a focus that it has been in England. So yeah, it's a really complex picture, and I think disingenuous to say that Scotland's in a better place.